Welcome to Science Headliners. Our discussion today is with Emily Anthes. Please welcome our host from Linda Hall Library, Vice President for Public Programs, Eric Ward.
Emily Anthes is a science journalist and author. Her latest book, The Great Indoors, The Surprising Science of How Buildings Shape Our Behavior, Health, and Happiness, was published in June 2020. She has a master's degree in science writing from MIT and a bachelor's degree in the history of science and medicine from Yale, where she also studied creative writing. Welcome, Emily. It's a thrill to have you join me today.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. I'm happy to be here.
I loved reading The Great Indoors. It's such a wonderful book. And I just wanted to begin with just a broad question. What drew you to the topic about writing about the indoors?
Well, as I acknowledge early on in the book, I am what I call indoorsy. I've always been an indoorsy person. I'm also a science writer, and so I spend a lot of time reading the scientific literature. And maybe about a decade ago, I started to notice these studies popping up where ecologists were actually surveying homes and offices and studying the ecology of our indoor spaces. And I had never really considered indoor spaces as something that had an ecology before. And so that just sort of opened my eyes and made me view my own home in a new way and prompted me to ask questions about what else don't I know about our indoor spaces and how they affect us.
Author Deborah Bloom wrote that a trip into the great indoors with Emily Anthes is a journey into fascination, dismay, and the occasional jolt of pure wonder. I thought that was such a brilliant description of your book because it is a journey for the reader, and you go from the invisible microbes in the home and this living ecosystem of indoor spaces to hospitals, schools, prisons, retirement homes, and then on you finish with future living spaces on the moon and Mars. And I was curious, reading the book's a journey. Was writing and researching the book also a journey? In other words, is the finished product what you envisioned when you first had the idea for the book?
Yeah, I think it's pretty close to what I envisioned. I mean, obviously there are some changes. There are things that dropped out. I was initially thinking about having a chapter on wayfinding, which is a whole field of research on sort of how our brains make sense of space and how we move through space. And that sort of dropped out just because there was more interesting stuff I found. But I always envisioned this as a really broad-based book, that I knew I wasn't going to really drill down deep on any one environment. And I wanted to give readers an overview of how all these different kinds of spaces influence our lives. So in that way, it is what I envisioned.
I found it particularly interesting that you actually visited the places that you describe, whether it was the hospitals and schools and houses that float in flood zones. And of course, you didn't visit the moon or Mars, but I found that interesting, especially how you shifted within the chapters to first-person present point of view when you're actually on the ground visiting these places. It really brought me into the space along there with you. What was your how did those visits shape the outcome of the book, what you were writing?
Yeah, those visits were really interesting because usually by the time I had visited a space, I had already spent some time on the phone talking to the architects, the designers, the people who dreamt up that space. And so I was pretty familiar with what their aims had been and what they wanted to accomplish with, this hospital or this residence. And then I was lucky that a lot of those same people, the designers and the architects, were able to lead me through the finished building while it was in use. And what that sort of made me realize and enabled me to do was to compare how well the buildings lived up to the architect's dreams. They'd wanted to create this school to make kids more active. Well, now 5 years later, how well was that working? And so that was really interesting in terms of letting me see firsthand not just the promise of design, but also some of the limitations, the things that the architects had hoped for didn't always work out as they had planned. So I think that helped provide a more nuanced and balanced view of all of this work.
And you mentioned that school that promoted activity, physical activity, but by making stairwells more appealing and more visible, and it certainly has opened my eyes to that as well. Where I work at a library and a lot of public buildings, you really have to search to find the stairwells, and it's often a closed door, and you're not even sure you can go through the door. But the elevator is right there and very, very prominent. Do you think some of these design elements that have been used in various places will become more prominent as time goes on?
Yeah, and so that research and field specifically is something that's known as active design, and it's relatively new. The last 10 to 20 years is really when it's gained steam, and that is absolutely has momentum behind it. A lot of cities and organizations are adopting elements of design. So that is something that is absolutely becoming more common, both inside buildings, but also at city scales. So when you see or read about cities, including here in New York, that are turning streets over to pedestrians or adding more bike lanes, those are all elements of active design that are really geared towards making it easier and more appealing for people to be active in their environments. So that's definitely something with momentum behind it.
And we're seeing that here in Kansas City. Kansas City is not, I don't consider it a pedestrian-friendly city, or it hasn't been in its past, but that's beginning to shift, and I see that as a welcome trend. Another theme that's common throughout the book, your book, is humankind's connection to nature. Bringing the outdoors indoors, whether it's through a window or even a mural or picture indoors. Could you talk about some of those design elements, and why do you think there's such a human need to connect with nature and the outdoors?
Yeah, well, so this is something I've been getting a lot of questions about over the last year because we're all stuck inside so much. And, one of the big lessons from the book is a little bit ironic. And that's, if you ask, how do you create a healthy indoor environment? It turns out one of the best ways to do that is to bring in elements of the outdoor environment. So whether that is actual plants or photos of plants, nature sounds, also things like fresh air. Bringing that in from the outside, we know is really good for that. And there's not one conclusive answer as to why this is so good for us, but most psychologists and experts in this field use what they sometimes term as the biophilia hypothesis. And basically that means that because of how we evolved out in sort of the rough and tumble of nature, we have this natural affinity for and attraction to nature. And so there's something about having nature in our spaces that helps calm us and relax us. And then that, of course, has all sorts of knock-on effects, like reducing stress and reducing the cortisol levels in our body, and so on and so on.
And even improving patient health that you wrote about in the book. If a hospital patient can see outdoors and view nature, it just helps in their healing process as well. I found that interesting as well.
Yeah, absolutely. A lot of this research was actually initially done in hospitals where obviously occupants' well-being is really important, and then has since expanded out to other sorts of places.
Another design element that I found interesting was the human connection, the human interaction, the need for the interaction, but also the need for privacy in some spaces, going back to hospitals where you wrote that studies have shown that patients who are in private rooms, rather than just rooms with curtains, are more apt to be more open with their physician and healthcare providers. I want to tie that into a post-pandemic world. Where do you think design will go in the future in relation to common areas and the need for public versus private spaces?
Yeah, well, so I think this was true even before the pandemic, but the pandemic has really highlighted it. And that is that flexibility in our spaces is really important. Another sort of big lesson from the book is that there's no one size fits all design. We all have different needs, and even our own needs change over the course of a day or a month. And so I think it's really important to create homes and offices and hospitals and those types of places that have different types of sort of micro environments. So maybe there's a big open lounge where people can gather, but there are also private rooms and private nooks. And even thinking more broadly than that, we've seen over the last year, a lot of us have suddenly had to turn our homes into offices or into classrooms for kids doing remote schooling. And so the more we can design buildings that allow for some flexibility in use, I think the better off we'll be, because we don't know what the next crisis is going to be coming down the pike, but there will certainly be one.
Yes, I think we're assured of that there will be something next. I want to touch on too your chapter on smart homes. You visited a retirement community here in Missouri, in Columbia, Missouri, that was designed to monitor the people's health and could even monitor if a homeowner fell or was injured in the home. How prevalent do you think those kind of design elements will be going forward?
Yeah, it's a little bit hard to say. I mean, I think they're still definitely niche. They're not super common. It is interesting that sort of the first commercial use case that is really starting to take off is in elder care for reasons that you might imagine. I think certain elements of that, particularly fall detection systems, are going to become really common eventually. Falls in the elderly are a huge problem. And, these systems can help ensure that people get the help they need in a more timely way, so they're not lying on the floor for hours and hours. Some of the other applications that are just sort of more broad-based, holistic screening of occupants, I think we're a bit farther away from widespread adoption of that, but certainly pieces of it, like the fall detection piece, I think are coming.
And there are a lot of privacy issues with that kind of surveillance as well, I know.
Yeah, and I mean, those issues are tricky, anytime, but they get even trickier when you're talking about an elder care population who may or may not have the ability to consent for themselves.
Right. I want to ask, shift gears a little bit and just ask about your career as a science writer. You have a degree in the history of science and medicine, and you also studied creative writing. How did you become a science writer? What was your career path in that?
Yeah, I mean, so I initially thought that I would be a scientist, go to grad school and get a PhD or maybe med school. I was really interested in neuroscience when I got to college. But gradually I realized that I was really interested in learning about science and talking about science, but that I didn't like doing it. I didn't like the lab work. I wasn't patient enough. It's often slow and painstaking. I was more interested in sort of talking about some of the big ideas. And I'd always been a writer too. Both my parents are journalists, so I'd always been interested in journalism. And so about halfway through undergrad, when I realized I don't want to do science, it sort of seemed like a natural shift to consider maybe I could write about it. And I think I'm a lot better at this than I would have been at being a doctor or a scientist. So I think it was the right call, not just for me, but for any potential patients I do not have.
Well, I don't know about that, but you're certainly a wonderful writer. I really enjoyed reading your book. It's very engaging, and you tell a great story. I want to end with. You're welcome. I want to end with just 3 quick questions. Just give me the first thing that pops in your head. You write about examples of future homes on the moon and Mars. What year, just give me a ballpark year, what year will humans once again set foot on the moon, do you think?
My gut instinct is 2050, but now that I think about it more, I think that's maybe too late. I thought you were going to say live on the moon, which would be much farther out. But in terms of returning to the moon, it might be more like 2030. I think that's not necessarily terribly far away.
What about Mars, setting foot on Mars? Not living there.
That might be more in the 2050 range, I would guess.
All right. Second question. What is the one indoor design feature that you would not want to live without? Assuming there's electricity, and which you can't always assume depending on where you live, but assuming there's electricity and things like that, what's one feature that you don't want to do without?
I would say daylight. That's a pretty easy one. That's one of the things I love about this apartment, and one reason we picked it, especially because even before the pandemic, I was someone who worked from home. And so I am spending a lot of time in this space, and to not have daylight would feel really oppressive, I think.
Yeah, it's interesting you said that. When I thought of that question, I asked myself that, and my conclusion was, windows, to see outside. Yeah, it's very important. All right, final question is yes or no. Do you now, as part of your household chores, regularly change your shower head?
I do not. I have not even looked into or touched my shower head since I first wrote about doing that for the book. So I mostly just do not think about it.
Okay. And for those of you who haven't read the book, that question will make more sense when you read the first chapter, which I have to say, you freaked me out with that first chapter. That was it was very eye-opening to see to learn about what's living inside our homes.
Yeah, that seems to be a common reaction. That was not my intent with the chapter, but you're not alone in being freaked out.
Well, Emily, thank you so much for joining me today. And the book is The Great Indoors, The Surprising Science of How Buildings Shape Our Behavior, Health, and Happiness. It's available anywhere you buy books or at your local science library. So again, Emily, thank you so much. And I look forward to reading your future books.
Thank you. And thanks so much for having me.
Science Headliners has been made possible by the generous donations you make to the Linda Hall Library.